The incident report arrived on my desk at the start of the third watch, flagged routine. I want to be precise about that. Routine. That is the classification that Deputy Signals Analyst Verathsal stamped on the header block before routing it to my review queue, and I will not fault her for it. By every standard the Directorate uses for such determinations, the incident was routine. A sidelobe bleed, the weak halo of signal energy that leaks perpendicular to any tight beam transmission when the transmitting array is stressed or slightly misaligned, had escaped from the combat frigate Vethaskal during a piracy suppression action in the outer pair of corridor, 14 days prior. The Vethaskal's primary distress burst had been aimed correctly at Kethavi Fleet Relay 7, received correctly by Fleet Relay 7, and acted upon correctly by the nearest available response unit, which arrived in time to assist. That much of the story was clean. The sidelobe bleed, a weak, scattered, largely incoherent ghost of the original distress transmission, had traveled in the opposite direction, essentially at random, and had apparently found its way to some dormant receiving array at the far edge of catalogued space. Verathsal noted all of this in a tidy 5-line summary. The sidelobe bleed had been logged by what appeared to be an old Earth emergency monitoring station. A listening post, designation unknown, frequency range consistent with human pre-expansion communication infrastructure. She noted that no response from Earth had been received. She noted that the Vethaskal's crew had been recovered, the piracy engagement resolved without further incident, and the corridor approach restored to standard patrol status. She recommended the entry be closed and archived. Routine. She was not wrong, she was simply not right yet. I am Senior Intelligence Analyst Saratham of the Kethavi Directorate of Signals and Outer Reach Assessment, assigned to the pair of corridor monitoring station at Helvath 4. I have held this post for 11 years. My job, reduced to its plainest form, is to read the things that other people have already decided are not worth reading, and to notice when they have decided incorrectly. It is not a glamorous posting. The pair of corridor is a wide, thinly populated stretch of frontier space, notable primarily for 3 things. The ore extraction operations along its spinward edge, which are profitable. The piracy problem those operations attract, which is persistent and irritating. And the fact that the corridor's outer boundary runs closer to human-charted space than almost any other stretch of Kethavi territory, which has historically been considered a geographic note of moderate interest and no particular operational relevance. Nobody at Helvath 4 worried much about Earth. Earth was distant. Earth was technically sophisticated. Earth had been a diplomatic counterpart of the Kethavi state for 63 years, and Earth had never done anything in the pair of corridor that required worrying about. The ore extraction operations attracted pirates occasionally. The pirates attracted suppression actions, and the suppression actions generated incident reports, and the incident reports landed on my desk for review. That was the cycle. It was a reliable cycle. It had been reliable for 11 years. I read Verathsal's report on the third watch of what I expected to be a standard administrative evening. I noted the sidelobe bleed. I noted the listed Earth monitoring station. I noted that no response had been received. Then, because this is, as I said, the plainest form of my job, I went looking for the monitoring station. This is not standard procedure. Standard procedure is to take the analyst's summary at face value and route the file onward. But 11 years in a posting, this quiet does something to a person's professional habits. You start pulling threads not because protocol demands it, but because the thread is there, and something in you wants to know where it leads. I queried the Directorate's alien infrastructure database for known Earth installations in the outer pair of region, and I found exactly one entry. Relay Anchor 7 Gamma, an automated listening station of human colonial-era construction, listed as dormant since before I was born, flagged as a non-threat historical artifact. Last active survey conducted 9 years ago. The survey had confirmed no active transmissions, No detectable power signature above background. No crew presence. Dormant routine. Historical artifact. I looked at that entry for a while. Then I closed it and went back to the incident report and looked at the Sidelobe bleeds frequency profile. The profile matched 7 gammas listed reception band precisely. I made a note in the file, not an alert flag, just an analyst's note, the kind of internal notation that documents a thought without escalating it. I wrote, receiving station appears to be Earth Installation 7 Gamma, listed dormant in the Directorate Infrastructure Database. Frequency match confirmed. No response received from Earth. Recommend no further action. I signed the note with my analyst code and routed the file to archive. That was the end of it. I was certain of that. I want to be precise about that too. I was certain. 17 days later, 31 days after the Vethascal's distress transmission, a vessel appeared on our long-range approach sensors at the edge of the pair of corridor entry corridor. Single vessel, non-Kethavi registry, transponder broadcasting on a standard diplomatic identification frequency. Earth registry, human diplomatic tender. I was in my office reviewing a completely unrelated signals intercept from the Spinward ore platforms when the duty officer, Senior Warden Althas Varek, sent me a priority summons. Althas Varek was not a man given to summoning people without reason. He had been posted to Helveth 4 for 7 of my 11 years there, and I had learned to read his communication style accurately. A priority summons from Althas Varek meant something had arrived at the edge of our sensor coverage that did not fit the ordinary categories. When I reached the watch floor, he was standing at the primary display with the expression of a person who has encountered a problem he did not know existed and would prefer to return it to wherever it had come from. The ship is hailing us on standard contact protocol, he said, by way of greeting. It identified itself as the EDS Outer Reach Liaison, a diplomatic tender of the Earth Directorate of Outer Reach Relations. It is requesting permission to enter the Helveth 4 administrative zone and to transmit a formal communication to the Kethavi Directorate of Signals and Outer Reach Assessment. He looked at me with an expression that suggested the next part was not going to make things simpler. Specifically, he added, to you. I looked at the display. The ship was far out, still beyond the approach beacon network, holding station with the calm patience of something that knows it has been seen and is content to wait for a measured reply. It was not a warship. I could see that immediately from the silhouette. Wrong profile entirely, wrong mass distribution, too few drive vanes for a combat hull, no visible weapons housings along the dorsal or ventral lines. It was exactly what it said it was, a tender, a liaison vessel. The kind of ship designed to carry paperwork, and the people whose profession is to explain paperwork to people who are not expecting it. Route the hail, I said. Althas Varek routed it. The voice that came through was unhurried and professionally courteous, speaking in Kethavi trade standard with an accent that placed the speaker somewhere in Earth's outer colonial administration. The particular, practiced, untroubled accent that comes from years of conducting exactly these sorts of conversations with counterparts who were not expecting them and required time to adjust. Helveth 4 Station. This is Earth Diplomatic Liaison Officer Venus Harriet of the Directorate of Outer Reach Relations aboard the EDS Outer Reach Liaison. We are broadcasting on frequency Alpha 7 in accordance with standard approach protocol. We wish to enter your administrative zone at your discretion and deliver a formal communication to Senior Intelligence Analyst Saratham. We confirm we are unarmed and operating under full diplomatic registry. We will hold at our current position until you are ready to receive us. The channel held its waiting silence. Tell them they may enter the approach lane and dock at the secondary civilian berth, I said. Standard clearance protocols apply. Then I went back to my office and sat down and looked at my hands for approximately 30 seconds while I considered a sidelobe bleed, a listening post listed as dormant. and the note I had written 17 days ago in a file I had since routed to archive. Then I called Verathsal. "The incident report," I said when she answered. "The Vethascal, the Sidelobe bleed." "Yes, sir." Her voice carried the particular wariness of a junior analyst receiving a call from a senior analyst about something she had classified and expected to be done with. "I need you to pull it back from archive and route it to my screen. And then I need you to stay available for the next several hours. We may need to reconstruct the full transmission record." A brief pause. "Has something happened?" "An Earth diplomatic tender has entered the approach lane," I said. "It is here to speak with me by name." The silence that followed had a quality to it, not alarm exactly, but the sound of someone reprocessing information they believed they had already processed and arriving at a different answer. "I'll pull the file," she said. The EDS Outer Reach Liaison docked at the secondary civilian berth 6 hours after it entered the approach lane, which was not an indication of any particular delay, only the standard transit time for that approach at the heading and velocity the tender maintained, calm and unhurried the entire way in, as if it had all the time in the sector and was in no hurry to spend it. Liaison Officer Venus Harriet came aboard with 2 aides and a carry case. He was human. Of course he was human. I had known he would be human. But there is a difference between knowing a thing abstractly and standing in a station reception room watching a human walk through your airlock with a carry case, and the difference is not small. The carry case in particular registered in the way that carry cases always do in these situations. It almost certainly contained paperwork, and paperwork delivered in person at a distance of several light days from Earth's nearest administrative center was paperwork that someone had considered worth the trip. Venus Harriet was a person of middle age by human standards, with the kind of face that has been in enough difficult conversations to stop registering any of them as surprising. He dressed in the formal gray of Earth's colonial diplomatic service. Neat, authoritative, without ostentation, the small outer reach relations emblem at his collar the only visible insignia. He shook my hand in the human contact protocol, which I had encountered twice in my career and found somewhat more direct than our own customs but not uncomfortable. His grip was firm without being demonstrative. "Analyst Saratham," he said, "thank you for receiving us." "I confess," I said, "I was not expecting you." "No," he said, "I imagine not." He set the carry case on the reception table and unlatched it without ceremony. "May we sit?" Sat. He produced a document from the carry case. It was physical, printed on fiber stock, not a data transfer or a screen presentation. I had not received a physical document from a foreign government in 9 years, and the formality of the fiber stock registered immediately. Physical documents mean you are expected to hold the thing, to handle it, to sign it with a physical instrument. Physical documents mean the party presenting them has thought carefully about the weight of the occasion. He set it on the table between us, oriented so I could read the header block. The header read, "Mutual Presence Accord, Kethavi Outer Reach Corridor and Earth Directorate of Outer Reach Relations, Draft for Ratification, Earth Calendar Year 4417, Outer Reach Relations Act, Section 9, Article 14. I looked at the document, then I looked at Venus Harriet. He had the expression of a man who has done this enough times to know that the person across from him needs approximately 30 seconds to process what they are reading before they are ready to have a conversation. He waited. I used the 30 seconds. "You received the Sidelobe bleed," I said. 7 Gamma caught it, yes, he said. 11 days after the incident. There was some processing delay. The station's reconstruction algorithms needed time to assemble a coherent signal from the scatter pattern. It is not a fast process, and 7 Gamma was not originally designed for partial signal reconstruction. The team that maintains it adapted some of the algorithms from our deep space survey infrastructure. Excellent work, but time-consuming. The station was listed in our infrastructure database as dormant, I said. It is not dormant, he said. It has never been dormant. The dormant classification in your database appears to be a cataloging error from approximately 9 years ago. Earth conducted a maintenance pass at that time, and the survey team that reported the results to your infrastructure records office apparently misread 7 Gamma's active power signature as background radiation. An honest mistake. We did not correct it in your records because we do not have access to your infrastructure database. I sat with that for a moment. 7 Gamma has been active continuously. 7 Gamma has been active continuously, he confirmed, in the even tone of a person confirming a fact they expect will take a moment to land. The outer pair of approach is one of 6 monitoring zones we maintain along the corridor boundary, standard practice for boundary regions of this type. I looked at the document again. 41 pages. I could see the thickness of it clearly from where I sat. 41 pages of formalized text on fiber stock, with Earth's official seal embossed at the lower margin of the first page. The circular device showing Earth's western primary continent, surrounded by the legend Earth Directorate of Outer Reach Relations, ratified. Ratified. On Earth's end. Already ratified on Earth's side before the ship left dock. You have already signed it, I said. We ratified it 3 days before the Outer Reach liaison departed Earth Station, he said. That is standard practice for an opening position. Earth ratifies first, then the counterpart reviews and either countersigns or returns proposed amendments. It is a gesture of good faith. It signals that the document you are looking at is not a draft we expect to be negotiated into something materially different. What you are holding is what it says it is. What does it say it is? I asked. I could read the header clearly, but I wanted to hear him say it. A mutual presence accord, he said. It establishes a protected passage corridor through the outer pair of approach, specifically the region of space that includes Earth's existing monitoring zone along your corridor boundary. The accord gives Earth the legal standing to maintain that monitoring presence on an ongoing basis. In exchange, it grants your vessels priority access to Earth's emergency response infrastructure within the corridor zone. If a Kethavi vessel in the outer pair of region transmits a distress signal, by any means, intentional or incidental, and that signal reaches one of Earth's monitoring stations, Earth is authorized under the accord to dispatch a response asset to verify the nature of the distress and offer assistance. Kethavi retains full authority to accept or decline that assistance at its discretion. He folded his hands on the table. We would have dispatched a response asset for the Veth-Askel incident, but by the time 7 Gamma finished reconstructing the bleed, the situation had already been resolved by your own forces. There was nothing left to respond to in a material sense, so we responded to the signal in the next most appropriate way available to us. With a treaty, I said. With a treaty, he said. I need to say clearly what I felt in the next several seconds, because I have been asked about it since, and because it is relevant to understanding what came after. It was not gratitude. I want to be clear about that. The accord was not a gift, and I did not receive it as one. It was not alarm either, or the territorial outrage that several of my colleagues, when I described this meeting later, felt I ought to have felt, the procedural affront, the what right did they have, the why were they there without our knowledge. I understood those responses. I could feel the shape of them, but they were not what I felt. What I felt was something closer to the particular sensation of reading a document you believe you have already read carefully, and suddenly encountering a sentence that you are quite certain was not there the first time. I had known 7 Gamma existed. I had looked it up myself. I had confirmed the frequency match. I had written the note. And in the 17 days between writing that note and sitting across from Venus Harriet in the reception room, I had allowed myself to fold the observation away, to process it as answered, resolved, filed. No response received from Earth. No further action required. Done. But 7 Gamma had had not been doing nothing. 7 Gamma had been doing precisely what 7 Gamma was built to do. It had caught the bleed, taken 11 days to reconstruct it from scatter, forwarded it through whatever internal Earth relay chain connected a distant listening post to the Directorate of Outer Reach Relations, and that directorate had spent the subsequent 20 days not sending a ship to where the Vethascal had been, because a ship sent to the former location of a resolved distress event would have been useless. But drafting a 41-page treaty that proposed to reorder the legal architecture of the pair of corridor approach, then they had ratified it on their end. Then they had put a liaison officer and a carry case on a tender and sent him here. The word for this, I thought, is systematic, not in the way that implies bureaucracy for its own sake, though the bureaucracy was clearly present and clearly functional, in the way that implies a system that was designed to do something and is continuously doing it, without making noise about it, without requiring anyone to notice, without waiting to be asked. I would like to read the full document before we discuss countersignature, I said. Of course, Venus Harriet said. He reached into the carry case and produced a second copy, my reading copy, still bound but without the ratification seal. Take whatever time you need. We are not going anywhere. I read the accord that evening in my office with Verathsal sitting across from me, both of us working through our own copies in parallel, trading the occasional low observation. We did not speak much while we read. When we finished, we sat for a moment looking at the last page. It's reasonable, Verathsal said. She said it in the tone of someone who had been reading carefully for the clause that was not reasonable and had searched 41 pages without finding it. More than reasonable, I said. The accord did several things. It formalized the legal status of Earth's existing monitoring presence in the outer pair of zone, the stations that had apparently been operating there for decades without any formal Kethavi authorization, not from any intent to circumvent that authorization, but simply because nobody had thought to ask for it, or known to ask, or had any particular reason to raise the question. It established clear protocols for what Earth's monitoring infrastructure would do with any distress signal received from a Kethavi vessel, reconstruct and verify, assess severity, determine whether the situation had been resolved by Kethavi forces, and if not, dispatch an inquiry vessel, not a combat unit, a contact vessel, with the option to escalate to response assets at Kethavi's explicit request. It specified the response window, the inquiry vessel's permitted operational range, the communications protocols for coordination with Kethavi Fleet Relay 7, and the conditions under which Earth's presence could be expanded or contracted within the corridor zone. The language throughout was precise without being aggressive, the language of a document written by people who expected it to be read carefully by people who would be looking for ambiguities. In exchange, Kethavi received priority acknowledgement on 27 specified emergency frequencies, plus any frequency consistent with a distress pattern as identified by Earth's reconstruction algorithms. Any Kethavi vessel in the outer pair of zone transmitting on those bands would receive an automated acknowledgement from the nearest Earth station within the hour, and a human response asset within 48 hours if the situation remained unresolved. 48 hours, not 14 minutes, not 90 seconds. 48 hours, a window calculated from actual corridor distances, actual vessel transit times, actual operational realities. A window, in other words, that Earth had clearly derived from genuine understanding of the geometry of the pair of corridor approach rather than from any desire to seem impressive. Article 29 was the passage I returned to most. It read, in translation, nothing in this accord shall be construed to require or compel Kethavi acceptance of Earth response assets. Kethavi retains full authority to decline Earth assistance at any time and for any reason. The purpose of this accord is not to create obligation, but to formalize capability, to ensure that if Earth's monitoring infrastructure receives a distress signal from a Kethavi vessel, Earth has the legal standing to respond, and Kethavi has the legal standing to accept or decline that response as it sees fit. The purpose is not to create obligation, but to formalize capability. I read that sentence 4 times. Varathsal said, "It's not a territory claim." "No," I said. "It's not an expansion of their footprint. They already have the footprint. They're asking us to acknowledge it." "Yes. And in exchange they're offering to use the footprint in our interest." "Yes." She looked at the page in front of her. "This is a formalization of something that already exists." 7 Gamma has been active continuously, I said. The monitoring presence has been ongoing. What they're formalizing is the relationship between what they've been doing and what we can now expect them to do. The difference between knowing a vessel is transiting your system and having a written agreement about what that vessel will do if it observes something wrong. Varathsal was quiet for a moment. They built the infrastructure first and then asked for permission afterward. I thought about this. They built the infrastructure, and then we sent them a distress signal by accident, and they decided that was reason enough to ask. I sent a priority message to the Directorate's Senior Coordination Office at Kethavi Fleet Command that night. I attached the full text of the accord, my notes on the Vethaskal incident and the Sidelobe bleed, and a short summary of the situation. I did not append a personal recommendation. This was treaty territory, not signals intelligence territory, and the appropriate offices were the ones with treaty authority. But at the end of my summary, I included a single sentence that was not quite a recommendation and not quite a neutral observation. It said, "The accord appears consistent with Kethavi operational interests in the pair of corridor zone, and the response infrastructure it proposes to formalize appears to have been functioning in alignment with those interests continuously, without prior Kethavi awareness, for an undetermined period." I hit transmit and went to my quarters. Venus Harriet stayed at Helveth 4 for 9 days. During those 9 days he was, in my experience, one of the more methodically patient people I have ever dealt with. He was not impatient when the Treaty Affairs staff from the Directorate's regional office arrived on day 3 to take formal custody of the negotiation process. He was not impatient when those staff raised questions about 7 specific articles and requested clarifying documentation. He answered every question, including the ones that were clearly test questions, the kind of question you ask not because you need the answer, but because you want to observe how the person responds to being probed. He answered those the same way he answered the genuine questions, directly, with complete information, without any visible calculation of what the information might cost him. On the 4th day, he provided on request the full operational record of 7 Gamma's activity over the past decade. Not a summary, the full record. Transmission logs, maintenance reports, calibration data, and the complete reconstruction file for the Vethaskal Sidelobe bleed, including the algorithm run logs, the technician notes from the reconstruction team, and the internal routing records showing how the reconstructed signal had been classified and forwarded to the Outer Reach Relations Directorate. He handed all of this over without hesitation, without conditions, without any apparent concern about what we might do with it. I asked him that afternoon why he had included all of that. "Because you're being asked to sign a document based partly on the claim that 7 Gamma caught the Sidelobe bleed and correctly identified it as a Kethavi distress pattern," he said. "The only way you can verify that claim independently is to see the actual record. Giving you the record is the minimum we owe you." "You could have provided a summary and saved some time," I said. "We could have," he said, "but a summary would have been less useful to you and would have been a signal that we were concerned about something in the full record. We are not concerned about anything in the full record. The record is what it is. You should see it." I considered this. Does the Earth Directorate of Outer Reach Relations always negotiate from that degree of transparency. He was quiet for a moment, genuinely considering the question, not performing consideration. No, he said eventually. Not in all contexts. The Pair corridor is a particular case. We have had a presence there for some time without any formal authorization, which creates a particular kind of obligation. At this stage of the conversation, withholding anything from the record would have been the wrong posture. Were you concerned, I said, that we would refuse to ratify? Yes, he said simply. We are always concerned about that. What would you have done if we had refused? He looked at me with the steady directness that I was by this point coming to recognize as his default manner. We would have thanked you for your time, returned to the outer reach liaison, and filed an internal review on the legal status of the monitoring network in the corridor zone. And then we would have spent considerable time deciding whether to approach you again in a few years with a different framework, or whether to accept that the monitoring network was going to remain in a gray area indefinitely. He paused. What we would not have done is continue the monitoring presence covertly without your consent, knowing that you knew about it. That is not a position we are comfortable with. I said nothing to that. There was not much to say to it that would have improved on the statement. On the 6th day, Fleet Command's message arrived. 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph confirmed that the Treaty Affairs Office had reviewed the accord in full and found no provisions inconsistent with Kethavi security interests. The second paragraph authorized the Regional Treaty Affairs staff to proceed with counter-signature and to execute the accord on behalf of the Kethavi Directorate, provided the final text contained no material changes from the submitted draft. I forwarded the message to Senior Envoy Kethavi, who had been running the formal negotiation sessions since day 3 with a methodical, unhurried competence that I found somewhat reassuring about our institutional processes. Kethavi read the message, reviewed the accord one final time, and on the morning of day 7 sat across the reception table from Venus Harriet and countersigned the document. The ceremony, if it could be called one, took 11 minutes. Venus Harriet signed in the space designated for Earth's representative. Kethavi signed in the space designated for Kethavi. 2 copies on fiber stock, one for each party, both signatures in physical ink. Venus Harriet shook Kethavi's hand. Kethavi shook his. Neither made a speech. I observed this from the doorway of the reception room. I had no formal role in the negotiation and no ceremonial standing. I was there because Varathsal had suggested I should be there, which was more institutional awareness than she usually displayed and which I appreciated. Afterward, Venus Harriet found me in the corridor. Well, he said. Well, I said. We'll depart at the end of the 72-hour post-signature window as specified in Article 36, he said. The Outer Reach Liaison will file a standard departure log with your approach authority. Yes, I said, I have one more question. Of course. The accord specifies a 48-hour response window from signal receipt for a Kethavi distress event in the corridor zone, I said. What specifically activates that window? What does Earth's monitoring network need to receive? He looked at me with something that was close to amusement, but was not quite amusement. Any Kethavi emergency frequency transmission on the listed bands, he said. Or any transmission that 7 Gamma's reconstruction algorithms classify as consistent with a distress pattern, regardless of whether it arrives as a direct transmission or as a scatter artifact. So a sidelobe bleed, I said. A sidelobe bleed, he confirmed. Article 19 was written with that in mind. I looked at him. Article 19 adds the Vethascal's frequency to the specified monitoring list. Article 19 adds the Vethascal's frequency to the specified list, he said. Yes. We stood there for a moment in the corridor light. We did not aim the distress transmission at Earth, I said. The Vethascal's signal was correctly directed at Fleet Relay 7. The sidelobe bleed was an artifact of array stress under combat conditions. From our side, it was an accident, an emissions artifact. I know, he said. The whole sequence of events that brought you here, this entire negotiation, began with a 5-line incident report that my deputy analyst classified as routine and non-actionable. I know, he said again. 7 Gamma's algorithms do not distinguish between intentional and incidental signals. It catches what it catches, reconstructs what it can reconstruct, and forwards what is consistent with a distress pattern. The intent of the sender is not part of the algorithm. That is, I said, a very large net. He nodded without any self-consciousness about it. It's a corridor monitoring network. The point is to monitor the corridor. You don't build a net and then teach it to only catch the fish you were expecting. He left on the morning of day 9. The Outer Reach liaison filed its departure log with Helveth 4's approach authority. Althus Varek confirmed the departure at his console and routed the log to the standard archive channel. The tender eased out of the secondary civilian berth with the same unhurried patience it had shown on the way in, transited the approach lane at the standard civilian heading, reached the corridor boundary, and disappeared into drive. I watched it go on the long-range display from the watch floor. Then I went to my office and opened the original incident file. I want to say something about those 9 days before I describe what came after them, because I think they are the part of this account that is most likely to be misread in the written record. The 9 days were not contentious. They were not a negotiation in the adversarial sense that the word sometimes implies, 2 parties seated across a table, each trying to extract the most favorable terms and concede the least. They were closer to a very long, very careful documentation process. Peleth 4's staff had genuine questions. Venus Harriet answered them with genuine completeness. When the questions revealed gaps in the Accord's language, places where the text was technically clear but operationally ambiguous, the 2 sides would produce amended language and read it back to each other until both were satisfied that the amendment said what it meant to say. This happened 7 times over 9 days. Each time, Venus Harriet drafted the proposed amendment on his side, Peleth 4's staff reviewed it, and they agreed on final wording within a few hours. There was no friction in this process, beyond the ordinary friction of 2 institutions, with different internal vocabularies, trying to write a single document that both could read without reservations. On the 7th day, after the countersignature, I sat in the corridor outside the reception room while Peleth 4's staff completed the administrative closeout and Venus Harriet's aides prepared the 2 signed copies for custody. Venus Harriet came and sat beside me. We did not have any particular business at that point. The business was done. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Of course." "When you were told that 7 Gamma had caught a Kethavi sidelobe bleed," I said, "what was the reaction in your directorate? Not the institutional response, the reaction." He thought about this. I appreciated that he thought about it, rather than producing a prepared answer. "Surprise," he said. "Not that 7 Gamma had caught the signal. 7 Gamma catches signals. That is what it does. Surprise that the signal was Kethavi. The outer pair of zone has had light activity for a long time. Most of what 7 Gamma catches out there is background noise and the occasional survey beacon from your ore extraction platforms. A Kethavi frigate-class distress burst, even in Sidelobe scatter, is a very different kind of signal." "And then what?" I said. "And then," he said, "the people whose job it is to decide what to do with a Kethavi distress signal received by an Earth station decided what to do with it, which, in this case, because the distress situation was already resolved, meant deciding what to do with the existence of the signal rather than with the emergency itself." He paused. The Accord was the answer they arrived at, not because it was necessarily the only answer, but because it was the most complete answer. The signal had revealed a gap in the formal record, between what our monitoring network was doing and what our diplomatic record with Kethavi said we were authorized to do. The Accord closes the gap. Was the accord already drafted? I asked, before 7 Gamma caught the signal. He looked at me. A framework existed, he said. The Outer Reach Relations Directorate maintains framework documents for a range of corridor neighbor scenarios. The specific accord you signed was drafted in response to this specific situation, but the thinking behind it was not new. I sat with that for a moment. So when 7 Gamma caught the bleed, I said, your directorate did not start from nothing. No, he said. We started from a framework that had been waiting for the right moment. For how long? He was quiet for a beat. Since we established the monitoring network, he said, roughly 14 years. I looked at the floor of the corridor. The floor was plain, station-standard gray composite, scuffed from years of foot traffic, ordinary in every way. I looked at it for a while. You built the network, I said. You established the patrol group. You maintained the monitoring infrastructure continuously for 14 years. And during all of that time, there was a framework document waiting for a Kethavi signal to give you reason to present it. That is an accurate description, he said. And the signal, I said, was a sidelobe bleed from a frigate under piracy suppression, aimed at our own fleet relay, that leaked sideways by accident because the transmitting array was stressed from weapons fire. That is also accurate, he said. I looked at him. You built 14 years of infrastructure waiting for a signal we never meant to send. He considered this for a moment, with the seriousness it deserved. We built 14 years of infrastructure because the corridor is a boundary zone, and boundary zones require monitoring, he said. We maintained the framework document because we expected that at some point, the existence of the monitoring network would need to be addressed formally. We did not know when that moment would arrive, or in what form. We did not plan for it to be a sidelobe bleed from a frigate engagement. But we were prepared for it to be something. You were prepared, I said. We were prepared, he said. We sat in the corridor for another few minutes. Then Pelathvor's aide came to tell us that the administrative closeout was complete and the signed copies were ready for custody transfer, and we both stood up and went back to work. I need to explain what the mutual presence accord actually meant in practice, because the formal language does not make it immediately apparent. What it meant was this: Earth's monitoring network in the outer pair of corridor, 7 Gamma, and the 5 other stations that Venus Harriet had, in the course of the 9-day negotiation, confirmed existed along the corridor boundary, was now formally authorized to receive and act on Kethavi distress signals. When a Kethavi vessel in the outer pair of zone transmitted a distress signal on any of the 27 specified bands, or on any frequency consistent with a distress pattern, that signal would be received by the nearest active Earth station, reconstructed if necessary, assessed for severity, and acted upon. If the situation was unresolved, a response asset would be dispatched within 48 hours. Response asset. The term appears in Article 23, defined in the Accord's glossary. Any Earth vessel or fleet element that the Directorate of Outer Reach Relations determines is appropriate to the nature and severity of the distress, subject to the operational availability of Earth's Corridor Security Fleet. Earth's Corridor Security Fleet. The phrase appears twice, once in the glossary, once in Article 23, subsection 4. For the purposes of this accord, Earth's Corridor Security Fleet shall be defined as the fleet elements assigned to the outer pair of boundary security zone as maintained by the Earth Directorate of Outer Reach Relations. I had read that clause on the first evening and noted it and moved on. It was not until the 5th day of Venus Harriet's stay, during a technical question session that Pelathvor's staff had organized to clarify the operational provisions, that one of the legal attachés asked the obvious question. The obvious question was, what is in the outer pair of boundary security zone? Venus Harriet answered it the way he answered every question, steadily, with complete information, without visible concern about the effect. The outer pair of boundary security zone, he explained, was a patrol area maintained by Earth's Outer Reach Defense Directorate along the human Kethavi corridor boundary. It extended approximately 3 light days on Earth's side of the catalogued corridor line. It was staffed by a standing patrol group of 6 vessels, 2 corvettes, 2 medium escorts, and 2 larger support vessels that served as long-range response platforms, rotating through on a 6-month deployment cycle. The patrol group had been maintained continuously in the security zone for 14 years. 14 years. The room was quiet for a moment. Pelathvor's senior legal attaché, a thorough person named Herath Salvar who had been making careful notes throughout every session, looked up from her notes and said, with the measured tone of someone choosing their words precisely, "For 14 years there has been an Earth patrol fleet positioned on the boundary of the pair of corridor, and this has not been disclosed in any prior diplomatic communication between our governments. It has not been concealed either," Venus Harriet said, without missing a beat. "The patrol group operates on registered frequencies and files standard transit logs with its own command structure. We have not advertised its presence. We have also taken no steps to conceal it. It would be visible on a standard long-range sensor sweep of the corridor boundary zone." Herath Salvar was quiet. "Has Kethavi conducted any such sweep?" "Our records do not show any Kethavi sensor sweeps of the boundary zone in the period in question," he said. "The corridor approach is wide. Your outer zone patrol assets are limited. The gap is understandable." It was understandable. That was the part that was most difficult to sit with. Not that Earth had done something threatening. The patrol group was on its own side of the boundary, doing exactly what a boundary patrol does. Not threatening, just present. Continuously present for 14 years, while no one on our side of the line had thought to look. Because no one had looked. The session continued for another 2 hours after the disclosure. Herath Salvar asked detailed questions about the patrol group's operational parameters, its permitted range of motion, the conditions under which it was authorized to cross the corridor boundary line, the chain of command connecting it to the Outer Reach Relations Directorate, and therefore to the Accord's response provisions. Venus Harriet answered each question with the same unhurried completeness he had brought to every question across the full 9 days. The patrol group was not authorized to cross the boundary without a specific Kethavi request for assistance under the Accord's terms. Its operational role was monitoring boundary security on Earth's own side of the corridor line and response asset staging. The 6 vessels were the pool from which an Earth response asset would be drawn if the 48-hour window was triggered. They were not a combat fleet in the aggressive operational sense. They were a positioned capability, a standing resource. The kind of thing you put in place because you have decided a corridor is worth being able to respond to on short notice, and you want the response time to be measured in hours rather than weeks. A positioned capability that had been positioned for 14 years. After the session, while Herath Salvar was compiling her notes and cross-referencing Venus Harriet's answers against the Accord text, I watched her face. She was not alarmed. She was not outraged. She had the expression of a person working through a very large arithmetic problem, adding up a long column of figures she had not known existed until an hour ago, finding that the total was internally coherent and not what she had expected the world to contain. She looked up at one point and found me watching her. "It was all there," she said, "not an accusation, an observation, the tone of a careful person documenting a fact." "Yes," I said. "The stations, the patrol group, the framework document, all of it was there." "Yes. And we did not know about it because we did not look." "Essentially," I said. She looked back at her notes. "That is a significant intelligence gap." "It is," I said, "and it is also, as best I can tell, not the result of any deliberate concealment on Earth's part, which makes it, in some ways, harder to account for." She paused. "Why harder?" "Because concealment would mean someone made a decision," I said. A gap created by deliberate concealment has an explanation, an uncomfortable one possibly, but an explanation. A gap created by not looking does not have an explanation. It just has a gap, and the gap is ours. She thought about this for a moment. We should have looked, she said. We should have looked, I said. She returned to her notes without further comment. There was not much more to say about it. After the session, I walked back to my office by the observation corridor, a long windowed passage along the station's outer hull. It was late afternoon by station clock. I stood at the window for some time. I thought about a sidelobe bleed. I thought about a listening post listed as dormant but not dormant. I thought about a treaty ratified before the ship carrying it left dock. I thought about a patrol fleet holding station in the outer zone for 14 years. And I thought about what Venus Harriet had said in the corridor outside the reception room after the countersignature, when I had asked him directly, "You built 14 years of infrastructure waiting for a signal we never meant to send." He had not corrected me. He had said, "We built 14 years of infrastructure because the corridor is a boundary zone and boundary zones require monitoring. We maintained the framework document because we expected that at some point the existence of the monitoring network would need to be addressed formally. We did not know when that moment would arrive or in what form. They had not known when the moment would arrive, but they had been ready for it. Consistently, continuously, across 14 years and an unknown number of deployment rotations and budget cycles and internal institutional reviews, they had maintained both the network and the readiness to formalize it, not because they knew a sidelobe bleed from a stressed frigate array would eventually find them, but because they had decided the corridor was worth the sustained attention and had sustained it. None of this was hostile. That was the conclusion I kept arriving at and then pausing at, turning over, checking again. The monitoring network was not hostile. The Accord was not a lever. The patrol fleet was not a threat. They were methodical. They were the expression of an institution that had made a decision 14 years ago and had kept making the same decision every 6 months when the deployment rotation came up for review. Someone signing an authorization. Someone approving a budget line, someone nodding that yes, the outer pair of boundary security zone rotation was continuing on schedule and routing the paperwork to archive. Not a dramatic arrival, not a fleet emerging from drive at a moment of maximum crisis with maximum effect. 14 years of quiet, registered, filing its transit logs presence in a zone that abutted ours, maintaining a monitoring network that caught signals it was never aimed at and reconstructed them and forwarded them, and when the right one finally arrived, produced a liaison officer with a carry case, and 41 pages of ratified text, and a manner so unhurried it was almost indistinguishable from patience. I stood at the observation window until the station's evening cycle brought the dock lighting on. I thought about the piracy suppression action that had triggered the Vethascal's distress burst. I thought about the array stress that had caused the sidelobe bleed. I thought about 7 Gamma, sitting in the dark at the edge of the outer pair of zone, catching scatter signals and running reconstruction algorithms, and forwarding what was consistent with a distress pattern, continuously, for years before the Vethascal existed. Then I went back to my office. I wrote the full incident summary and filed it at the senior level where it belonged, all attachments, the Accord and its complete negotiating record, Venus Harriet's operational documentation, my notes from all 9 days of the process. I appended a 3-page assessment. The assessment said several things. It said the Mutual Presence Accord was consistent with Kethavi interests and recommended its operational implementation. It said the Infrastructure Records Division had been tasked with a comprehensive review of dormant classified foreign infrastructure along the corridor boundary. It said a proposal for expanded long-range sensor sweep coverage of the outer corridor zone was being prepared for Fleet Command's consideration. And in the 3rd paragraph of the 2nd page, in plain language, it said that the assessment's key finding was not the Accord itself, or the monitoring network, or the patrol fleet. The key finding was that all of these things had existed, continuously, in good working order, apparently functioning as designed, and that we had not known they existed because we had not looked for them. Not because Earth had hidden them. Because we had read a routine incident report confirmed that no response had been received and filed it. Verathsal had not been wrong to stamp that report routine. She had been accurate about everything she checked. She had simply not known to check for the things she could not see. The network that was not dormant, the patrol fleet on station at the boundary, the institutional process that had taken an accidental scatter signal and turned it, in 31 days, into 41 pages of ratified treaty delivered by hand to a monitoring station that did not know it had sent anyone anything. That process did not announce itself. It did not wait to be noticed. It was designed to catch signals and process them and respond to them in an orderly way, and it did that, and had been doing that, for longer than anyone at Helveth 4 had known to account for. I wrote a paragraph in the assessment that I rewrote 3 times before I was satisfied with it. It said, "The primary operational vulnerability identified by this incident is not the existence of Earth's monitoring network or patrol presence, both of which the mutual presence accord has now formalized in a manner consistent with Kethavi interests. The primary vulnerability is the gap between what our infrastructure database records and what foreign infrastructure is actually doing in our adjacent boundary zones. The dormant classification error for 7 Gamma existed for 9 years and would have remained in the record indefinitely if the Sidelobe bleed had not provided indirect evidence that the station was active. We do not know how many similar classification errors exist for other foreign installations along other boundary corridors. The Infrastructure Records Review will provide a partial answer. Active sensor sweeps will provide a more complete one." It was not a comfortable paragraph to write. It was accurate, and accurate is what these assessments are for, so I wrote it and left it. The last line of the assessment said, "The mutual presence accord is now in force. The protected passage corridor is active. Earth's monitoring network and corridor security fleet are formally authorized to operate within the terms of the accord. Analyst Saratham recommends no further action on the original incident file." I signed it. Then, because 11 years of habit are not easily set aside, I opened the original incident file one last time and read Verathsal's summary again. 5 lines. The Vethaskal, the Sidelobe bleed, the frequency match, the dormant listening station, the routing to archive. Her final line, "No response from Earth received." I added a note at the bottom of her summary. Not a correction, she had been accurate at the time she wrote it. Just an update to the record, the way records are supposed to be updated when new information arrives. The note said, "Response received. Nature of response, mutual presence accord 41 pages ratified by both parties, accord text attached. Status, resolved." I saved the file, I closed it. The approach lane outside the observation window was quiet in the evening light. Somewhere past the edge of our sensor coverage, the monitoring network was listening, the same way it had been listening for years, the same way it would continue to listen. The patrol fleet was on station in the outer zone, the same way it had been on station for 14 years. And now there was a document, 2 copies of 41 pages on fiber stock, one filed at Helveth 4 and one aboard the Outer Reach liaison already in transit back to Earth, that said both parties knew about it. That was the change. Before the Sidelobe bleed, everything present, everything functional, nothing formalized, and no one at Helveth 4 looking in that direction. After the Sidelobe bleed, the same presence, the same network, the same patient fleet at the boundary, and a piece of paper that said what would happen the next time a Kethavi vessel in the pair of corridor sent a distress signal. Any distress signal. On any frequency. Intentional or not. I sent Verathsal a message the next morning before first watch. I told her that when she reviewed the next incident report involving a sidelobe bleed or any other incidental signal reaching a foreign installation. She was welcome to classify it in whatever category the evidence supported. But she should first confirm the active status of every foreign installation within signal range of the bleed's origin point. And she should not rely solely on the Directorate's infrastructure database for that confirmation, since the database had proven to contain at least one dormant classification that had been incorrect for 9 years. She wrote back promptly. Her message said, "Understood. What database should I be checking instead?" I thought about this. It was, in its way, the correct question. She had done exactly what the Directorate's existing procedures told her to do, and those procedures had pointed her to a database that was wrong. The answer to her question was not a different database. There was no different database. There was no Directorate reference system that cataloged Earth's active monitoring installations in the outer corridor zones with any more accuracy than the one she had already checked, because nobody had built one, because nobody had had reason to build one, because the Directorate had been operating on the assumption that the monitoring installations listed as dormant were dormant, and that the ones not listed at all did not exist. That assumption had been wrong for at least 9 years with respect to 7 Gamma, and for an unknown period with respect to the 5 other Earth stations Venus Harriet had confirmed along the boundary. The infrastructure records review would take months and would not be complete when I sent this message, and Verath Sol needed an answer she could use tomorrow morning, not in 3 months. Then I wrote, "Check the database. Then verify independently whether the database is accurate. Reach out directly to the relevant foreign diplomatic registry if a frequency match exists and the installation status is uncertain. File a note about the gap between what the database says and what you can independently confirm. That is the job. The job does not end at what the reference system says." She wrote back, "Yes, sir. How do I verify independently if we don't have access to Earth's installation records?" I considered this for a moment. Then I wrote, "Active sensor sweep of the installation's listed coordinates. Direct contact on the relevant diplomatic frequency if you receive a signal return. The Accord now gives us a formal point of contact within Earth's Outer Reach Relations Directorate for exactly this kind of query. Use it." She wrote back, "Understood." I closed the message. I looked out at the approach lane, the secondary berth empty and quiet now, dock lighting cycling through its standard morning sequence, the corridor beyond it open and ordinary in every direction. Somewhere out past the boundary, holding station in the 3-light day zone on Earth's side of the cataloged line, the corridor security fleet was rotating through its deployment cycle, filing its transit logs with its own command structure, maintaining its frequencies, running its standard operational pattern, waiting in the same patient way it had been waiting for 14 years, for a signal that might or might not arrive, on a frequency that might or might not be on the specified list, from a vessel that might or might not know what it was sending. Not hiding, never hiding, just not advertising. The signals analyst's job, reduced to its plainest form, is to notice the things that other people have already decided are not worth noticing. I had stamped a sidelobe bleed routine. I had confirmed a frequency match. I had noted a dormant classification. I had written that no response from Earth had been received, and I had believed it, and I had routed the file to archive. All of that was accurate. I had simply not known, at the time, what Earth's idea of a response looked like, or how long it had been in preparation, or how quietly it had been there the whole time, maintaining its network, rotating its patrol group, keeping its framework document current, waiting, as it turned out, for someone to accidentally send it a signal. I know now. The corridor is active. The Accord is in force. If a Kethavi vessel in the outer pair of zones sends a distress signal, by any means on any frequency, with any intent, 7 Gamma will catch it, and reconstruct it if it needs reconstructing, and forward it, and 48 hours later a response asset will arrive. This was true before the Accord, in an informal and unauthorized way. It is now true in a formal and authorized way. The only thing that changed was that we looked, finally, in the right direction, and found that something had been there, looking back at us, for quite a long time.